All right. Welcome to our Mochi Podcast, the only podcast rated R for Robin. My guest today is master of counterculture himself and founder of Mochi, Playerzer0x. Playerzer0x, thank you for joining me for the podcast, episode 28.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah.
28's a special number for me, so
Any particular reason why?
Sense. No. It's a completely irrational decision for why I like that number.
Cool. All right. So you are the founder of Mochi. You are also a character created technically in as part of a Mochi project. Am I correct in that?
I think so. Sounds reasonable to me.
Mm-hmm. What is Mochi? Like all the people we've had on the podcast before, have been related to Mochi, have been our friends of Mochi. What is Mochi to you? How did it kind of start, and where did it come from?
Sure. Well, I think first and foremost, I think Mochi is all of those people that you've already interviewed. So I think it's great that I'm coming in kind of late because this project, in short, is really not about me or anybody that really started it. It's about this community of people that have been together now for almost 3 years and probably extending before that in the origins of this. So Mochi started, um, I would say like the first ideas of it extend past beyond those 3 years. And this really started kind of as a dance party of a lot of really early crypto people that were there at kind of like the foundational stage of Ethereum. Many of us living in New York City. And what we noticed together was that there was a severe lack of cultural um, kind of programming happening in the space. Most events mostly centered around bars and drinking. And we just kind of, enjoyed partying in a different kind of way. And it really started as like a couple of dance parties and some dinner parties between a group of people and slowly evolved into something a bit more serious.
Mm-hmm.
Now Mochi um, does a lot of things and does a bit more than just throw parties. We build a lot of tech. So Mochi is also what we call a coordination game that helps DAOs and decentralized teams stick together. So it's one part a cultural project and it's one part a technical project. And those two things form what I would call the DAO of Mochi.
And you say DAO as a, but this is one of the things that I thought was interesting with like as I got into the crypto space. Just kept on hearing DAO because it's decentralized autonomous organization, but I always heard it from like the perspective of like Taoism and like the Tao of doing things, or the Tao of doing things, the way of trying to live like
Hmm.
in a harmonious way. I don't know how intentional that was. There's it seems like there's a lot of like messaging and iconography that's like mixed in the crypto world, crypto metaverse narrative. And I imagine part of it is intentional, and I'm curious as to how much of it is unintentional and coincidental.
Yeah, I think we should allow ourselves space for happy accidents and serendipity in our lives, but some things do end up being intentional, and I think the DAO thing is very intentional. We're working fundamentally what I would call spiritual, magical kind of space, dream space, if you will. And
Are you talking about like the
there's a
Mochi
lot of
community specifically, or like people in like Web3? The
Yeah, I would say like, Web3 and probably deeper crypto. And even before that, there were other ways of conceptualizing the space. Web3 is a relatively new term that's kind of popped up in the last, well, not popped up, but like has taken hold in the last year.
Mhm.
Before that, most people just referred to it as crypto, and some people reacted to that or thought it wasn't broad enough. And before that, we were trying to make blockchain a word, and that wasn't a word. And trying to explain what that was to people was a big challenge. But I would say, the what's common across the space is that like you have to take really complex, strange, abstract ideas and boil it down to these tiny three-letter acronyms.
Mhm.
And DAO was one of the first ones, and in fact, the whole space could even be conceptualized as a DAO, but I don't think it's a mistake that it's tied to kind of like, different ideas that draw from, Eastern mythology or Eastern belief systems. There's a very serious streak of esotericism in crypto that's present if you look deep enough. And yeah, that's probably one of my favorite parts of this. But yeah, I take the term DAO very literally, and obviously it's evolving to kind of take its own, it's taking its own life, or take not taking its own life, it's taking on its own life, and but there is something to kind of the yin and the yang, the dark and the light, of this concept of Tao that I think is very real and meaningful in the concept of thinking, in terms of thinking about how new organizations should be formed.
Hmm.
So yeah, it's part intentional, part serendipitous.
So with like DAO is essentially like a new term for like organization, but it's specifically within like the Web3 space. What would you say is what is there like a fundamental difference between what would be a DAO versus like a club or a gang or like a following or a cult or a religion? What separates, I guess, ideologically or aesthetically, a DAO from one of these other organizational groups that we're kind of more familiar with in the history of the world, I guess.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Because like everything you mentioned, gangs, groups, teams, clubs, cults, religions, whatever you want to, cities, states.
Fraternities, orders.
Yeah, they're all like, varying levels of scale of people getting together, right? And I think with DAOs, I mean, you could describe so many things as decentralized and autonomous organizations, but I think with DAOs specifically as it relates to Web3, they're organizations that at their core use Web3 tech. They have some idea of a shared treasury, and that treasury is run, more than likely on a decentralized blockchain. And there's a notion of having your own token, which is, not too dissimilar from having your own money as a small city state or something like that. But
Hmm.
um, I think fundamentally DAOs are experimenting with what is bleeding edge magical tech, and shared treasuries, crypto wallets are an important part of that thing.
Hmm.
You could even go into NFTs, use as membership, kind of gating things like that. But I think at the core, it has to do with you are using this tech that's coming out of an emergent space, and you're also playing with different kind of organizational, theoretical, cybernetic systems theory, like kind of ideas to reshape fundamentally how we interact and coordinate for a world that's increasingly remote and virtual.
Hmm. Is like this new like DAOs is this new form of like organizational planning setup? Is this a substitute, or is this a way that would like is this a thing that would replace legacy systems, legacy organizational groups, the way states would
Yeah.
organize government, et cetera, et cetera?
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I think so. When I came into this space, I think there is this burning desire, and in a very literal sense, to kind of like burn things down and replace them with new technology. We're all very excited about this stuff kind of being used by everybody, and the kind of rallying cry was like, "Oh, the world is kind of broken. Banks are like totally messing everything up. Let's get rid of all of them and let's replace it with crypto tech, that kind of thing." As I've gotten older and spent more time in this space, what I've realized is that like these things don't really work. The world doesn't really work that way. You don't fully replace anything, really. I think things just get invented and they slot in where there's a need. And if you think about it, like this is true of all kinds of technology. When cars were invented, we didn't get rid of horses and bikes. They just kind of like shifted their function in terms of how often we use it and for what did we use it for,
Hmm.
right? People still ride bikes, people still drive cars, and people still ride horses. It's just like one is not dominating. Well, cars are, but that's
Yeah,
that's slowly changing.
there's a winner there.
Yeah, there's a winner, but we have all other forms of transportation. I don't think airplanes completely replace cars when we needed to do international travel. They just fit a very specific use case. So, the same is going to be true about crypto. I think there will be more companies and organizations that are not DAOs adopting more of this tech because it makes a lot of sense. Like when the web was emerging and you were just working with like kind of like, unconnected technology, cash registers, that kind of stuff. If you looked at that and go, oh, like I don't need to adopt that, it doesn't, it's just like you would have hurt yourself as an organization. Many organizations now like understand the need of having websites and like having smart terminals and these kinds of things. And I think they'll come around to wanting to use crypto and whatever it is that they're doing. That being
Hmm.
said, it's like it doesn't have to all be new all the time. I mean, you can see the bottom of my screen. I'm sitting in my garage with a bunch of equipment that's literally from like 50 years ago, 60 years ago. Speaker technology hasn't really evolved that much in the last 50 to 60 years. And sometimes the best stuff for certain use cases comes from a different era.
Hmm.
So it's a mixture. It's a mixture of both. I don't think anything really fully replaces. I think we just kind of mishmash it and put it together where in a way that makes sense for us.
Hmm. So then, like with Mochi, as like, so originally you said it was created as like an accident, sort of like trying to find culture within like within the community that you were in, and so like Mochi has become like its own club. It's become like a whole system, but it's also grown out to be like a service, a tool, a system for helping set up other DAOs. What are your ultimate goals within Mochi, and then conversely, what are your ultimate goals like outside of Mochi? Then.
Ultimate goals. We have big dreams, but I would say like our approach is really to start small. I think when you look at this space and you think about what's possible with crypto and like tokens and like these kind of like newfangled little like signals that we can use to move people around the world, if you blow it out to its widest vision, you start to get some crazy thoughts and ideas. It's like it's no wonder this idea of like network state has kind of like taken hold. It's because, well, when you start looking at money as a core coordinating kind of force of our global society today, and you think about playing with that, immediately you start thinking about creating new worlds, which is why we use some of that iconography, in our marketing.
Hmm.
But we really think about, Mochi and DAOs as like spawning new worlds that are emergent and are again going to be kind of more remote and virtual. But we're going to have to find our homes in these new worlds. And well, how does one build a new world? So again, to take this back to the beginning of like what we were thinking about when Ethereum was launched, was like we all came in with this kind of like belief that like the world as currently presented was like about to collapse. This was the dominant narrative, and
It's like
the
2017,
technology that
right?
we were building. No, this was like 2014.
Oh, okay.
So 2014 Ethereum launches, and anybody who was around back then kind of saw what was coming, and like we're currently going through it right now, and it's slowly unfolding. But people saw that vision back then, and we're like, okay, we need to start building, because like once that thing starts crumbling, there needs to be something to not replace it, but to augment it,
Hmm.
and support it
Offset the
and create new
damage.
structures. Yeah, yeah. So people started building, these kinds of things, and you came in with this question of like, the world is messed up. We have to make a new world. But where do you start with that, right? It's like, where does one start when thinking about making a new world or a new organization or a new DAO that's supposed to fix all of humanity's problems or whatever? I think it's kind of like a joke, right? Or it's like a trope when people join startup land or join tech. They're
Hmm.
like, oh, we're going to change the world. It's a very kind of youthful idea, and like, it has some nostalgia about it. But it's older, more seasoned, techie people or people who have spent a lot of time building. They hear somebody say that and they go, that's a nice thought, right?
Hmm.
Increasingly, you think about how, um, over time, you think about not about like completely changing everything, but like, how do you make, one small change that will make the world a little bit better? And that's more of the approach that we like to take in Mochi. So it's like dream big, but you got to start small. And the way that we start with is with habits at the team level. And down beneath that, individuals make up teams,
Hmm.
and we use the technology that we're all building, crypto, Web3 technology, to create incentives and disincentives that help guide people's behavior towards whatever it is that they're trying to accomplish. And everybody's got their own mission, everybody's world building. We just want to support people in that mission.
Mm-hmm.
And not only within our own community, but outside of our community. So there are many other communities that have different ethoses, different stories, different origins, different reasons for being. And we have where we are opinionated is that there's a set of core practices, rituals, things that you do every day that can bring you closer to that goal. And those things are kind of universal. But everything beyond that, deciding how your community looks, how it feels, how it organizes, what it is you guys do together, that's all up to you.
Mm-hmm.
But we want to support you in whatever world building that you're doing.
Mm-hmm. So what would you like kind of so Mochi in itself is both the connection, the tooling set for other DAOs to use and utilize, and then Mochi is its own club. What would you how would you describe like the spirit of it? Like what are like the kind of beyond just we are setting goals for ourselves and we're just doing whatever. Are there like kind of uniting factors within just the at least the core base of like the Mochi Club?
Well, I mean, like if you think about what mochi is, it's glutinous sticky rice. If we want to talk about uniting and that kind of stuff, if you think about what a mochi is, it's a small little confection, a Japanese rice cake. There are some disagreements about where mochi actually really comes from, but this idea of taking small grain rice, sticky rice, and then putting them with bunching them up together and kind of like with a big wooden mallet, smashing it together until it becomes this paste, and then forming it into this kind of like malleable, flexible, stretchy, compressible, firm, but also kind of soft material. It feels kind of like glue, and that's kind of how we think about what mochi can be used for in an organization, keeping things glued together, keeping things coordinated or stuck together.
Hmm.
So I would say that's kind of the spirit of it. It's like, we're very intentional about, a grain of rice is something very small, but you put it together and you use it in this way, and it can be used to kind of keep things together.
Hmm. So what about like the aesthetic of Mochi? It's very we got like these mochis in the corners of our screens. You can see from like the site. There's a lot of like these little like kawaii figures. Okay,
Hmm.
what is up with the aesthetic of it? Because like a lot of the crypto space is very like very sleek, sharp, techy, very like cyberpunky. Can you tell me about like the direction with the aesthetic that we're going for with Mochi?
Yeah, we're trying to, I don't know, keep things quiet, keep things cute and cozy and like kind of gamey and, just fun and playful. There's deeper reasons for why we do that, apart from it just kind of being cute and something that's attractive that draws people in. I think nurturing a playful spirit in the way that you present yourself and the way that you approach world building and your life is one of the most important things you can do when you're playing in fundamentally kind of like disruptive radical space.
Hmm.
Because the risk is if you're trying to change the world or like you're trying to create technology that's going to change something, the risk is that you're just recreating the same thing when you're like getting down to the nuts and bolts of how to make something move, or how do you bring some people together, or how do you like direct attention and these kinds of things. It's very tempting, and in fact very comfortable, to kind of just like throw your hands up in the air when enough things don't work, to go, oh, there's only one way to do it, and it's the way that we've always done it before. um, I would say that's a crisis of adulthood, and
Hmm.
the way that you combat that is through play, is through returning back to that inner child that all of us have, and all of the things that we like to do when we were young, and feeling no shame about going into that space and just playing and experimenting and seeing the world with new eyes.
Hmm.
So that's why play and like cuteness and kind of like fun is
Because on
like
its
in our
face,
kind of.
it's a
Yep.
game, right?
Yeah, yeah, we think about it as a game. Yeah, mochi is a coordination game. Yep.
Hmm. Gotcha. And so, what would you say are kind of like your like artistic, your aesthetic influences that have kind of influenced your both personal taste in style, and then also kind of like guiding both like this game and your approach to the metaverse and new tech and stuff.
Well,
new tech and media, I
I
guess.
I would say for Mochi, I grew up kind of like enmeshed in Asian culture, and I grew up a lot, you know, um, just loving things like, like anime and playing little games like Pokemon. I'd say Pokemon was probably like the most dominant like force where I learned like, little activities like, could lead to leveling up in something, and like playing with tiny little creatures that helped you along your journey, that kind of thing.
Hmm.
That was very much Pokemon for me. And there's something very Pokemon about like the whole space, really collecting cards and stuff. It's Pokemon didn't invent it, but like that's definitely the aesthetic we lead on.
That would imply a level of sinisterness because Pokemon is also a very dark, creepy game at a certain level.
Yeah, I mean, dark and creepiness is, there's we all got that part of ourselves.
Hmm. Your so the Player0x avatar also is a character that was created um for the first issue of the Mochi zine. Um, can you tell me a little bit about this character, little bit about this like your avatar, I guess?
Yeah, sure. I mean, Player Zero is a moniker that I adopted when I was trying to figure out how to not present myself as founder or CEO. There's still very much of that ethos inside of crypto, which is just like, when we think about changing things, or you think about how to reorganize or restructure organizations, naming and language is really important, and the way that you conceptualize and present yourself is really important. And I actually learned this from the previous founder whose company I used to work at. He referred to himself as flounder,
Hmm.
like the fish. And I was like, oh, that's fun. We have somebody who's like in a position of power, and like by all means should be a very serious thing, referring to themselves as a floppy little fish. The
Slash
things that we
B
do,
character from Little Mermaid.
yeah. Yeah. So I mean, you have to take the things that people present to you as serious. Just like, take them for how they are, and like, acknowledge that. And for me, I had to think about, well, okay, I don't want to put founder or CEO, like what makes sense for this game that we're making. And I thought a little bit about growing up and, playing video games. And I'm the oldest of my family, of a pretty big family. And I grew up playing a lot of video games, and because I'm the oldest, like, I kind of have the natural say of playing on the top screen, and that's where I'm sitting right now, right? It's like player one is like the dominant hierarchy when you're playing video games. I was never relegated to the bottom screen or the right.
Or the
I
janky
got
controller.
always, yeah, I always had the best controller, and like, this was the hierarchy of growing up for me. So Player0x is in one part a nod to crypto, the whole 0x kind of like,
Hmm.
address naming scheme, but it's also me trying to intentionally subvert myself in, always putting myself in this player one kind of mode. Like I am the person who is like, traversing this world, dominating this game, trying to accomplish my mission, and it's all about me. And so it's me trying to subvert kind of like a lot of that innate ideology that is latent in me as just as a result of being the oldest child. The other part of it too is Ready Player One is such a I think a
Book slash movie.
well, it is such a book. It is also such a movie. I like the book more, um, and that's a rare one because usually I like the movies. But um, yeah, it's this kind of idea of like more of our lives being spent in some kind of like hybrid of like metaverse virtual space and like, IRL space, is like, that's obviously a very big kind of meme inside of the crypto space.
Hmm.
And it's a bit
IRL
dystopic
versus
if you ask
URL, you
me.
mean?
IRL, URL, yeah, virtual meta, I don't know. Like none of these terms are particularly appealing to me. They're not my aesthetic, but like you can't ignore that they're like huge. Cyberpunk is a huge aesthetic that's inside
Hmm.
of this space. In fact, it's pop culture now. It's not even radical. It's just pop culture.
Hmm.
So, I think Ready Player One is kind of a dystopic view of the future. I don't want to be spending, inordinate amounts of time in a less fidelity space, interacting with people. I want a higher fidelity space of interacting with people. So, it's also kind of like my reaction and revolt against this, like, kind of kitschy metaverse thing that comes from 80s like kind of science fiction.
Hmm. So like with because Mochi does a lot of like in-person meetups, parties, and whatever. What would you say there's like a would you say it's like more important to be having like the in-person events for organizations than just like strictly online meetings and communities? Because I know people like we've got with the coronavirus and stuff and everybody having to work more remotely, organizations are now adapting to change to people being in different places and not being able to see each other. But how important would you say that having the parties and the meets are to build to fostering both like culture and like teamwork within a community or organization?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's more important. I would say that it's harder to do.
In
And
person
like
or
things that
online?
in person.
Hmm.
So, like meeting in person is definitely harder to do, especially in the space where all of your friends and people who work in crypto are pretty decentralized. Everybody lives in different cities.
Hmm.
Well, there's a big concentration of them in New York, Berlin, Lisbon, of course, but like I live in, on the West Coast. So it's like I'm kind of far away from where there's like hives of it. So it's like, yeah, it's hard to build community, and community can exist virtually and like in person, and the in-person part is a bit harder to do. And I guess what I would say about it is like the things that are hard to do tend to be a little bit more rewarding. Not that you can't find reward and find community online. It's just that when you come into person, like you get different bells and whistles going off. Your body and being in embodied space feels like physical reward. And not only that, it's nice to be in touch with people physically,
Hmm.
really, like that. And there's so many kind of interactions that can happen just kind of serendipitously, naturally, by being in a space physically with somebody.
Hmm.
So I would say it's just as important. It's a little bit harder to do for different reasons. But if it's something that your community doesn't do currently, you should definitely think about doing it more.
Because
Yeah.
I'm definitely thinking about how companies now that everybody's had to work remotely, uh everybody likes with companies that rented office spaces or own buildings, getting their employees to clock in clock out every day. Now that we're working remotely, now that a lot of people that organizations have seen that they're not necessarily more productive by just being in a physical space, but at the same time people form cultures within within like this physical space, and like going to staff parties, going to the Christmas party, whatever. I just wonder how much that's going to be changing as organizations start progressively moving more online, working remotely, or if they go into like a 3D, like the virtual space or something.
Yeah, I think we're already seeing it start to change. I don't know that it's at a place where we can really, like compete in a meaningful way with like having physical space. I think it would be a dream to have a physical space where we could, kind of work, play together. Obviously, that's a very expensive thing, huge fixed cost, not something you should really explore as a startup, I think, too soon. But there's a point in time where I think, it makes a lot of makes a lot of sense to have people kind of like in the same space.
Hmm.
People are experimenting with things online and meeting in like virtual space. I think, there's really great examples of 2D versions like Gather Town, where you kind of have like this Pokemon-esque like meeting rooms and like, spaces where you can play and like create little experiences for people. And then you have all the kind of like metaverses where people are building offices in something like crypto voxels.
Hmm.
Um, cool little one-off experiments. It gives you a little bit of a sliver of like, what might come. And if we start like expanding it even to like, strapping headsets onto our heads and meeting in virtual space like that, I could see part of our experiences, kind of, some of our experiences happening increasingly on there. But again, I don't think it's a replacement.
Hmm.
Um, it's a skeuomorphic kind of copy and a response to a very particular situation that we're dealing with in the world right now. And I think yes, we'll kind of like spend more time in that space, but it's fundamentally a different experience, and it's one's not going to replace the other. We're going to continue to do both.
Hmm. So with other communities, because Mochi has been like reaching out with other communities, and because like Mochi has been part of an accelerator cohort with Seed Club, what kind of communities kind of jump out at you Like what are the qualities or vibes that you look for in other DAOs to work with or to onboard into either to share Mochi or to just kind of what how do you filter what are interesting projects and what aren't?
I filter for common values. So I think there's like a big mistake that people make when they're talking about community in this space, or talking about like how you form community or how you gather and attract people. There's this common trope that people say like, "Oh, we're looking for like-minded individuals." I don't look for like-minded people. I look for people with common values to ours. I made a lot of mistakes growing up looking for like-minded people because that just creates an echo chamber of your own thoughts.
What does
I
that
don't
mean
want other
between the
people.
distinction
Yeah,
between like-minded versus sharing values,
common values.
common
Yes.
values?
Yeah. So like-mindedness is usually actually, if you stare deeply enough into like how some of these kind of like cultural plays like market themselves, like-mindedness is a common thing that comes up. And really what they mean is like of a common class.
Ah,
And I shouldn't even use that word common. It should be of a particular class. It's kind of a dog whistle for like, oh, you have to kind of like, be cut from our cloth,
mm-hmm,
in what is usually a kind of like a class way. It's like we only attract high caliber creative individuals or high caliber financial individuals, that kind of thing.
mm-hmm,
So like-mindedness actually ends up kind of falling flat on its face when you really analyze it. It's really quite simple. I don't want people who think like me around me. It's like that's just a recipe for like sniffing your own farts. Like it's just you don't get new ideas by hanging out with people who are just like you.
mm-hmm,
But what I do care about is that we have common values, that we value commonality, that we value the commons, that we value um, there are simple things that like we cherish about life and celebrating it, that connects us far beyond just the way that we think about things, which changes every day.
mm-hmm.
So when I think about attracting people to Mochi and then other communities that might use Mochi, what I look for is like, we have some kind of bond that extends beyond just how we're currently thinking about things. And you challenge me, in fact, in my thoughts, but we can still kind of hang out and our values kind of still align.
Mm-hmm.
And where I would say that kind of like leads us usually is like, we tend to kind of like, a lot of the organizations that we're working with tend to be organizations that care about, making things more fair and equitable, and using creative kind of approaches to doing those things, um, in whatever it is that their community is doing. So we've attracted a lot of communities that are making music, for example, or playing with artificial intelligence, or working towards women having more equity in this space. Things like that. It's like we value a lot of the same things. And I think when you think about how Mochi operates, and I won't spend too much time talking about how the game actually plays, but it's a methodology that if you are lucky, like me and some people in this space who are like able to work for a company where they teach you new paradigms of organizing and coordinating work, things like agile,
Mm-hmm.
you learn something that's like a very powerful tool for like succeeding in life. But if you're not that kind of person, you never end up learning something like this, which like for me is like one of the most valuable things I've ever learned. And this kind of methodology should not be relegated just to people who work in tech. I would love to see that methodology used, played with, to make things outside of tech. If
Mm-hmm.
you are a creative, if you are an artist, if you're a musician, everybody struggles with making things every day. And Agile and like what we've developed with Mochi can be used to help you succeed in whatever your creative endeavors are. So I think it's this project also kind of spawned after I spent a lot of time thinking about how to make blockchain work for music, and I've always been very passionate about subcultural space in in music and the arts. And I always was thinking about how do we use this technology to make the world brighter, sound better, more imaginative, and how do we engage the arts and music in this technology in a meaningful way. And this is the best thing I've been able to come up with.
Hmm. Interesting. So with with like a bunch of these organizations that are coming up, like some often have contrasting viewpoints of like how to approach decentralizing finance, uh decentralizing like title ownership, with there being so many new companies that are sprouting up around the same tech roughly. What would you say is more important right now, competition or collaboration between uh different communities in similar spaces?
Um, it's a tricky question. It's a good question. My natural inclination is to say collaboration, but like true collaboration is actually quite difficult to achieve. The space is still very small. This is what we need to remember and remind ourselves of. Like, this is still a very nascent, emergent space that's still trying to figure out how it even talks about itself to
Still
external
very
communities. And
wild westy.
yeah, it's a little bit less Wild West, today than it was in 2014, 2015.
Hmm.
And clearly NFTs have kind of punctured pop culture space, right? Like when NFTs start to get talked about in places like, SNL and South Park here in the West,
Hmm.
it means that, like, we've kind of hit a phase, but still the space is really very, very small. We're talking about a several billion dollar market, or sorry, I should say trillion-dollar market, in at its peak, and and now has kind of retracted down to kind of more sober levels. And it's like, well, we've done this in 10 years, but still there's still so much left to go. And I think the ethos that will continue to drive us towards, again, more fair and equitable kind of outcomes for more and more people is a spirit of collaboration rather than competition.
Hmm.
Competition is healthy. It can be used to drive activity in meaningful, powerful, effective ways. But if we can opt towards taking the first step towards extending a hand and seeing if where we can work together and support each other's mission, if we do that first, I think that can get us somewhere meaningful and different from the way the world is currently conceptualized.
Hmm. So what would you say right now is like the biggest obstacle to development, either technologically, societally, socially?
Trust,
Mm.
trust, and patience with people. At the core, it's always we're still dealing with humans. Yes, we're building tech, but it's humans building the tech. Hopefully, the tech will, help us enable us to do more things, have more events, gather more often with people. But at our core, we're still working with humans, and we're still struggling to trust each other, to keep each other's interests and our vulnerabilities in mind when we interact with each other. I think we made, a slight mistake, or it's not really a mistake. It's just we didn't really know, again, how to talk about this stuff early on. But, a lot of the narrative early on was like trustlessness, or like trustless protocols, or like we don't need trust, or like things like that. Like you don't have to trust banks to run your own crypto card or whatever.
Hmm.
And I think that was a reflection of the kinds of people that had entered this space, people who have been traumatized by,
Super jaded.
decades, yeah, jaded, or traumatized from decades or even a lifetime full of like not being served by the current economic systems that pervade our world. And so a lot of the narrative was like, you don't have to trust anybody anymore. Like, like code is law, like it executes perfectly all the time. And like, we don't need to trust each other to interact or whatever. I think that narrative is somewhat damaging, and we're still kind of dealing with the effects of it. And what we need to foster more of in this space actually is increasing trust between each other, between people, and increasingly between humans and machines, because quite frankly, most people are not going to have the kind of educational set to even really fully dive in, or the time really, to fully dive in to understand what some of this tech does. And we're going to have to trust each other that it's doing what it's supposed to do, and that in doing those things, it's leading us to fairer and more equitable outcomes.
Hmm. I thought you were going to be going down the route of like because the AI are coming. Ugh.
Oh, I mean, they're here already.
Um, but yeah, so I think that's a lot of what you said with like not having to trust people is very same thing with people like learning to not trust, you know, big tech companies especially, just like the ethos of move fast, break things, and just keep going along with it is very you know, how do we know what is going to be sticking around? It's just whatever is the next. Well, what's the next multi-billion-dollar company to throw $1,000 at 10 years ahead of time? And I feel like everybody is now, especially with the way the markets are and stuff. Everybody's jaded about the the way people make money, the way money is this tenuous thing. Um, and I definitely see how that's like affected a lot of the imaging for crypto, especially because like the birth of it was still it was specifically a currency. It was this thing that was completely speculative and just like it didn't have a use. It didn't have a value aside from what people were putting into it. Very similar to, you know, a lot of stocks and shit that.
You know, there's yeah, there's a lot of things there. But if I could pull a nugget out of what you just said,
Mhm.
now is not the time to get jaded about money. Like I want to be very, very clear about that with people, especially ones who are like more creative or artistic and like kind of view money as like, you know, a demon or something that we need to crush in this world. Now is not the time to get jaded with money. Now is the time to experiment with making new forms of value, right?
Mm.
Money is a really good kind of just like abstract container for the things that we care about and value. And I would challenge anybody who is getting jaded about money to start your own community and figure out how you take the value that you create in that community and exchange it with other communities.
Hmm.
Right? Think of something better than money. Right? Use what we have right now, which is tokens, and like that's a very intentional kind of like, you know, to go back to like the way that we talk about things, tokens is a very intentional thing. Where else do you see tokens in the world?
Arcades.
Exactly. Right? We're playing a big game here. And like I encourage you to create your own game in your own community, play with some tokens and see how you can reward activity inside of your group to make awesome things together because really what else is there to do? Right? Now is not the
Mm.
time to get jaded. Now is the time to dream. And like I would encourage you to start dreaming and thinking about and imagining new ways that we can exchange value with each other and drop the money thing, start thinking about it as tokens and explore, experiment. This is something that happens constantly throughout human history. Whenever there's a depression cycle, a recession, and the global currencies start to destabilize in value, the first thing local communities start doing is experimenting with their own money. This has happened all throughout history, all throughout the world. Small little towns, small little companies start issuing their own currency, and trying to get people to kind of transact and keep coming back and like using the things that they're making or buying the things that they're selling. The problem is, when these things get big enough, it gets hard to trace paper currency. So like, you know, my little like, you know, grocery store that I started where I was like, you know, handing out little script money to get people to kind of keep buying things through a depression. As we start issuing more and more of that currency out and like that currency moves and goes outside of our town and outside of our area code and stuff, it's like how much do we have, how much supply do we really have and how much can I charge and like how do I price this thing? Very, very, very difficult. And that's where the local currency thing kind of fails. But
Hmm.
now we have a globally decentralized, fully transparent um, ledger, basically, that can keep track of where all of the money is. And like it doesn't have to get lost. We know exactly how much has been issued at any given time. And now's the time to experiment. And this experiment is happening globally and it's happening in thousands, if not tens of thousands of communities right now. And why shouldn't you be one of them? So again, don't be jaded about money. Like get creative. Now is the time to really think about it because if you don't, you know, it's just like the dollar is your daddy, basically.
Interesting. Don't be jaded. Get creative. What is something that you distinctly recall hating? A piece of media that you recently have digested that you distinctly recall hating?
Hmm. Um. Oh boy, I can't really. So I don't really. I don't know. I don't think I have like really strong feelings like that I would kind of encapsulate in the form of hate for a piece of media. But the thing that came to mind, something that I'm critical of, that everybody liked
Mm,
was the recent A24 film Everything Everywhere All at Once,
mm-hmm,
the Michelle Yeoh film. And and the reason, like, I don't hate it is, like, I saw it twice, and I actually brought my family the second time to go watch it. It's not that I hate it, it's just that I think it's a piece that's important to watch, and it's a piece that's important to watch critically. And I have my own personal criticisms about it, but it was still fundamentally an entertaining film. But everybody else liked it, and I go, I don't know, like, maybe you should think a little bit harder about that film.
what's it called? Everything.
Everything Everywhere All at Once.
I can never say it correctly because I have the Bo Burnham song, anything, everything, all of the time, stuck in my head. Just anytime the title
Yeah,
comes up, I default to that.
yeah. It's one end of the spectrum, and people used to, when I was working at that company that I was at before this one, I would, like, sometimes walk up the stairs and people would ask me, "Hey, what's going on?" And I would say, "Well, everything and nothing all at once." You know,
Mm,
everything and nothing all at once. There was a Tao to the way that I approach things and answer that question. This one is just, like, fully on one end, and it's, like, emblematic and reflective of the culture that we currently live in. And I don't think it's something to celebrate personally.
hmm. Why is that? Just because it's like it feels very valueless in terms of like personal like spiritual enrichment or.
No, well, I think it leans too far into this, like, overly abundant entertainment society that we live in, and it's just like, oh, the only kind of, like, the only antidote to basically the nihilism that comes out of, like, this kind of increasingly decentralized, unfurling hydra of entertainment is to, like, I don't know, like, process your trauma with your Asian mom or something. And, like, it's there's all kinds of tropes that are kind of baked into it that they try to address that, in my opinion, they don't do enough justice to.
Mm,
But, to their credit, the fact that they tried to do it is meaningful enough for me and is
hmm.
something that I think should be celebrated. But I don't think, like, leaning into this hydra is the way that we combat it. And, like, it's like every head that gets cut off, a new one pops out. That's kind of how it is. And, like, we have to find a different way to deal with the hydra. I don't really think about cutting off its heads. I think about wrangling it with rope.
Mm. Hercules burnt the. I think he smashed their heads in and then burnt the burnt the stubs, or sliced them and then burnt the stubs.
Yeah. Yeah. Curious. You're more of the expert in I think with ancient mythology. So
I have been reading a little bit more of like the Heracles stuff, which it's funny how creative that guy is. It's not just like he's strong. He was very very creative about smashing things.
hmm,
Yeah. Um. So you are essentially cosplaying as your character, and I know this is one of the big things that with the idea of like trustlessness in the Web3 space. What where would you say like the value is like more emphasis is placed like the idea of people being anonymous or people having like a verified history of things because to a degree people want to remain keep certain things parts of their lives private but also the idea of having everything recorded constantly and verified and validated is something that like seems to motivate a lot of people too or at least businesses.
yeah, yeah. I think you have to look at the intention, kind of the, what are people trying to do with those things. And, quite frankly, I'm not super enthused or, going back to this trust thing, we have to foster more trust. And I don't think we foster more trust by being anonymous or, like, pseudonymous or, like, whatever, is, like, the anonymous word that, like, everybody's into right now. Well,
Hmm.
in fact, I have a word that I like more. It's heteronymous. Um,
Mm,
uh, so so I think, like, anonymity and pseudonymity or whatever that's kind of like emerging out of, like, new identities spawning every time somebody clicks a wallet. I think that's one approach to, like, doing dastardly things, which we've seen over and over in this space, which is like, yeah, we're kind of playing, experimenting, and oop, things don't work, and they break sometimes, and there goes $100 million. I don't think that's the way to foster trust. But there is something interesting about being in space and having control over your birth, right? You know, when you
Hmm.
come into the world as a physical body, you know, as embodied spirit, when you're born from, your parents, the birth certificate is, something that's giving to them, but it's controlled by the state. Your name is given to you by your parents, and then like you kind of like this is what you more adopt your identity than you are really born with anything kind of innate about it,
Hmm.
beyond the obvious things about our biology that come from our parents. Um, and there's something interesting about the rebirth of coming into crypto and like creating a new identity literally when you create a new wallet. That is something that can have a bank account, that is something that can have an address tied to it, kind of like your street address or whatever, that can never be taken away from you and can never be controlled by some other entity other than yourself. And I don't think we give proper credence to that. Like that is one of the most powerful things you can give a human being is like agency over their identity. It's
Hmm.
one of the most radical things I can think about it. And we're like, what do we think about doing with it? Buying a bunch of monkeys and like, trading cards, like, and like, it's like, what is that? Right. So I don't want to like, I don't want to down PFPs too much because it's the first kind of step in like thinking about, oh, like, we have different avatars and like we can use these avatars for different things and whatever. But I would really encourage and push people to think about what it means to have agency over your identity and the opportunity that's given to each and every one of us to craft out new identities for ourselves in a space that is like, a place of play, and we're creating new worlds. The new worlds need new characters and they need new superheroes and superheroines, and we should stop using the ones that were given to us from the 80s, and we should start creating, stepping into the heroes and heroines that we are in ourselves, right? And like it's an opportunity to literally create new characters with every identity you spawn, and that's what I've done with Player0x. It's like, why should I show up to work in like, I don't know, my base identity stuff when I can like show up as a freaking superhero, and like the people who get it and have been around have been doing this for some time. We're all kind of characters and we all kind of fit a certain role, but like more people should start doing it. And crafting an identity is not an easy thing. It's easy to buy a PFP, but to like build an entirely new kind of like character is tough, and like
Hmm.
creatives know how to do it, and I want to see more creatives doing this kind of thing.
Yeah, I imagine but yeah, but there's a lot of deliberacy that needs to happen with creating a character and crafting a story for yourself. I just wonder how much the average person is going to be like on board for that, or feel comfortable enough dealing a new hand or playing with a new hand as opposed to like the one that they've already seen and know how to interact with.
Yeah, I'm not trying to reach the average person really. I'm trying to reach the, young people that get it. It's like, like we all know these terms like non-binary, right? Like what it means to be fluid with identity, what it means to have multiple email accounts, and each one of those email accounts does something different. Like all of the algorithms are different for each one of your email accounts that you use to sign up for whatever service and whatever. And like I think the younger generation fundamentally understands that your identity is flexible. I'll give you another example from like, a little bit back before, and like, maybe the older people will kind of glom onto this, but so many people have moved to Portugal and Lisbon, um, and are now sitting in a culture, right, and kind of just like occupying space there. And like there's a crypto scene there. And like I'm curious how many of them have read like the literature, like the beautiful, incredible, deep literature that's come out of, that country. So when I went to Lisbon for ETH Lisbon, I stayed in the Pessoa Hotel on the recommendation of another friend that was in Mochi who told me I should read Pessoa. And I was just like, I forgot about it, and I came to Lisbon, and like without even thinking, I booked the Pessoa Hotel. Um,
Hmm.
just it was a word that I recognized, and I didn't really get it until I got there, and there was just like a whole library dedicated to this guy's works. And I started reading it when I was there, and like literally kind of blew through my mind. So this guy created this concept. I don't know if he created this concept, but like his entire life was dedicated to this concept of creating heteronyms, right? So we have
Hmm.
anonyms, we have pseudonyms, which are like you just hiding the person you are behind like a bunch of like, words and letters. But a heteronym is a distinct identity that you craft out and create that is fundamentally separate and has its own life apart from the other heteronyms that do exist. And Fernando Pessoa spent his entire life in obscurity, crafting out like 5 or 6 different authors that he wrote as, all with different names, all with different beliefs, all with different like thoughts, feelings, anxieties, professions, and like ways of and actually like voices and tones in writing. And
Hmm.
his stuff was like, sat in the trunk until he died, and they discovered it afterwards. And like it turned out this like one guy was like 6 people, right?
Hmm.
Like that is sitting inside like a cultural hub right now in Lisbon. And I don't know if the crypto people there know it, but like that's what is available to us. Like when you create a wallet, you can
Hmm.
create a new heteronym. Like put a helmet on, I don't know, like put a weird jacket on, go get a PFP artist to like make a character for you. That's what I did, and start exploring the strangeness of identity, and realize that you are actually multitudes.
Yeah, sounds very like what's the thing called where you like fragment part of your identity. Uh,
Yeah, I think people in the West would call it multiple personality disorder, and for me,
Dissociative
I'm kind
personality
of a
disorder.
yeah, I don't know. I'm like a functional schizophrenic, so that's how we do it.
Gotcha. All right. So again, I'm aiming for the hour with this podcast. Do you what things would you like to plug? Mochi, we got mochi.game, got mochi.world, where there's a lot of things for people to kind of like check out what's going on with different
Mhm.
things in the game in the community. We got a zine that's going to be coming out in September. What else am I missing? What anything's coming up that you'd plug?
Yeah, the zine that's coming up is non-binary. That's awesome. I would love to put a call out to our community that, if you have an interesting take on what non-binary means to you, and again, I think that's probably a perfect segue of like this last thing I was talking about, what non-binary means for your identity, or identities, and like, maybe you want to create as a new person. That would be really interesting. Come contribute something to the zine. Our team's going to be in Paris next week for ETHCC. So we're, going to be kind of like hitting the road and like getting back into the conference circuit, getting back in touch with people out there. So we'll be there all week. Come say hi if you're going to be in Paris. And then the other thing that I'll plug is the Dream Oscillator, the Mochi Dream Oscillator. So we're experimenting with our first themed cohort, centered around the art of lucid dreaming. So if in case you didn't know this, you can actually be aware in your dreams when you are asleep, and you can actually have agency in the things that you do when you sleep, and you can quite literally create worlds when you are sleeping intentionally. And that is called, lucid dreaming. And we're going to use Mochi and the Dream Oscillator to basically teach people how to do that over the next 8 weeks. So I'm very into dream aesthetics right now and thinking about how dreams are metaverse, like true, proper metaverse. I'm very into this idea of pajama punk as a response to kind of cyberpunk's like serious kind of like crypto ninja aesthetics.
Hmm.
And showing up, we all work from home right now, so show up to work in your pajamas is basically the way that I think about it. But keep dreaming. Honestly, like this dream big, start small thing is like not a very. It's a very important kind of thing to keep in mind. Um, like the space is for you to create whatever it is that you want, that you feel like will bring people together, and that's ultimately what this is about. I have a mentor that reminded me of something, when we first started working together, that it's all about people in a room, nothing else matters. And that's fundamentally what Mochi is about. So keep showing up, keep dreaming, and I don't know. I guess I'll see you soon wherever we intersect.
Dope. All right. Well, this has been our Mochi Podcast, episode 28. Player0x, thank you for coming on.
Ciao. Thanks for having me on.
Yep. And let's do this.